Australia, 1941. 3 submachine guns lie in thick mud. The Thompson, America's gangster gun. The Sten, Britain's war machine. And a crude weapon that looks like it was built from scrap plumbing. Officers watch as each gun is pulled from the muck and tested. The Thompson jams, the Sten fails, the ugly gun fires flawlessly. This is the weapon they tried to ban. When Evelyn Owen walked into the Australian Army headquarters in 1939, carrying blueprints for a submachine gun, he had no formal engineering credentials, no military pedigree, and no connections to anyone who mattered. What he did have was a design for a weapon that would eventually save thousands of lives in the most brutal jungle warfare the world had ever seen. But first, he would have to survive something more dangerous than any battlefield: military bureaucracy. Owen was 24 years old, a tinkerer from Wollongong, New South Wales, who had spent his evenings after work sketching designs in a cramped workshop behind his family's home. The year was 1939, and Europe had just plunged into war. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Australia would be drawn in, and when that happened, Australian soldiers would need reliable weapons. Owen had studied the submachine guns available at the time and saw fundamental flaws in all of them. So he decided to build something better. The weapon he designed looked nothing like what military officers expected, while the Thompson submachine gun, with its polished wood stock and sleek barrel, resembled something from a Chicago gangster film, and the British Sten gun maintained at least a veneer of industrial sophistication. Owen's creation looked like someone had raided a plumbing supply store. It was built from basic steel tubing, had sharp angles where other guns had curves, and featured what would become its most controversial element: a magazine mounted on top of the weapon instead of the side. To the officers who first examined Owen's blueprints, this top-mounted magazine was proof that the designer had no idea what he was doing. Every professional military weapon in the world used side-mounted magazines. The British used them. The Americans used them. The Germans used them. This was the established design, refined over decades by professional engineers in major armaments factories. Who was this civilian nobody to suggest something different? The mockery began almost immediately. Officers passed Owen's blueprints around headquarters, laughing at the crude drawings and the audacious claim that this backyard invention could compete with weapons designed by the finest military engineers in the world. One general reportedly called it an insult to professional soldiers. Another said it looked like a plumber's nightmare. The top-mounted magazine was singled out for particular ridicule. It made the weapon top-heavy, they said. It would be impossible to aim properly. It violated every principle of weapon balance that had been established over centuries of firearms development. But the rejection went deeper than just aesthetics or unconventional design choices. Australia in 1939 was still very much a nation that looked to Britain for leadership and validation. As a Commonwealth country, there was an unspoken assumption that the best weapons, the best military doctrine, and the best ideas came from London. The Americans, with their industrial might and combat experience, commanded similar respect. The notion that a civilian from Wollongong could design something superior to what British and American engineers had created was not just unlikely, it was presumptuous. The Thompson submachine gun was legendary. It had gained fame in American gangster wars and was respected for its firepower and reliability. The British Sten gun was being mass-produced by the thousands to equip Commonwealth forces around the world. These were proven weapons from proven nations. Owen's gun was an unproven design from an unproven designer in a nation that, militarily speaking, saw itself as following rather than leading. Between 1939 and 1941, Owen's weapon faced not just rejection, but active sabotage. Senior officers who preferred British equipment worked to block it from even reaching the testing stage. Owen submitted his designs repeatedly, each time being told that the military was satisfied with existing options. There were proper channels to go through, endless committees to satisfy, and always the implicit message that weapons from major powers were inherently superior to anything Australia could produce locally. The political calculations were obvious to anyone paying attention. Officers built their careers on relationships with British and American counterparts. Adopting British weapons meant maintaining traditional bonds with the Commonwealth. Using American weapons meant strengthening ties with a rising superpower. But championing an Australian design offered no political advantages. and considerable risk. If the weapon failed, the officer who had supported it would be remembered for poor judgment. Better to stick with established options from established powers. Owen grew increasingly frustrated. He knew his design worked because he had built and tested prototypes himself. While officers in headquarters debated aesthetics and worried about offending British suppliers, Owen was in his workshop conducting practical tests. He would fire the weapon hundreds of times, deliberately introducing dirt and mud into the mechanism, testing it in rain and humidity. The gun kept working, but without official military trials, his private testing meant nothing. What Owen didn't know was that he had one quiet ally inside the military establishment. Gerard Vincent was an army officer who had actually examined Owen's designs with a technical, rather than political eye. Vincent understood weapons, and he understood what Australian soldiers would face if war came to the Pacific. He had read reports from the conflict in Europe, and knew that existing submachine guns had serious reliability problems in harsh conditions. The Thompson, while powerful, was heavy and complex, with numerous small parts that could fail. The Sten, designed for cheap mass production, was notorious for jamming. Vincent looked at Owen's crude design and saw something the other officers had missed: simplicity. The weapon had fewer moving parts than its competitors. The straight blowback action was mechanically straightforward. And that ridiculous top-mounted magazine, Vincent realized it might actually be brilliant. If gravity naturally pulled spent casings and debris downward, they would fall away from the mechanism, instead of accumulating inside it. This could solve one of the fundamental problems that plagued other submachine guns in dirty conditions. But Vincent was not senior enough to force a trial on his own authority. He needed leverage. That leverage came in late 1941, when Japan's aggression in the Pacific made conflict inevitable. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether Australia would enter the war, but whether Australian soldiers would have weapons that could function in tropical conditions when they did. Vincent used this moment of crisis to push for comparative trials. He argued that the military had nothing to lose by testing Owen's weapon against established competitors. If it failed, they could dismiss it permanently. If it worked, Australia might have a weapon that could save lives. Reluctantly, the senior command agreed to limited trials, but they structured the tests in a way that seemed designed to humiliate Owen's weapon. The Owen gun would face direct comparison against the Thompson and the Sten, tested by professional soldiers who already favored the established weapons. The trials would be comprehensive, testing everything from accuracy to rate of fire to reliability under stress. Everyone expected the Owen gun to fail at some point, confirming what the generals had believed all along. The initial tests were conducted under normal conditions at a proper testing range. All three weapons performed adequately. The Thompson had its characteristic heavy, controllable fire. The Sten was lighter and faster. The Owen gun fell somewhere between them in terms of handling characteristics. On accuracy tests, all three weapons performed within acceptable ranges for close-quarters combat weapons. Nothing dramatic emerged from these standard trials. Then came the harsh environment testing. This was where the trials became real. The testers took all three weapons and submerged them completely in thick, heavy mud, the kind of mud that soldiers would encounter in tropical environments, in river crossings, in foxholes during monsoons. The weapons were left in the mud long enough that it penetrated every crevice, coating the internal mechanisms. Then each weapon was pulled out, given only a brief shake to remove excess mud, and immediately test-fired. The Thompson went first. It was the heaviest and most solidly built of the three weapons, with a reputation for reliability. The tester pulled the trigger. The gun fired one round, then jammed. The side-mounted magazine had allowed mud to enter the receiver, and the complex bolt mechanism couldn't push through it. The testers cleared the jam and tried again. Another few rounds, another jam. The Thompson, for all its legendary status, could not function with mud in its internals. Next was the Sten gun. Britain's answer to cheap, mass-producible submachine guns had an even worse performance. The Sten's simple construction meant it had more gaps for mud to enter, and its side-mounted magazine created the same vulnerability as the Thompson. The weapon managed one or two shots before jamming completely. Multiple clearing attempts couldn't get it functioning reliably. The Sten had failed even more dramatically than the Thompson. When they pulled the Owen gun from the mud, officers expected similar results. This was the weapon that looked like a plumber had built it, the weapon that violated conventional design principles, the weapon they had spent 2 years mocking. The tester pointed it downrange, pulled the trigger, and it fired. Then it kept firing. Round after round cycled through the weapon without a single jam or hesitation. The testers looked at each other in disbelief. They submerged the Owen gun in mud again, coating it even more thoroughly. Same result. Flawless operation. The secret was that top-mounted magazine everyone had mocked. When the weapon was held normally, gravity pulled mud and debris down and away from the breech instead of into it. The expelled cartridge casings fell straight down through the ejection port, carrying any loose dirt with them. The side-mounted magazines on the Thompson and Sten created horizontal chambers where mud could accumulate and block the mechanism. Owen's unconventional design had turned gravity into a cleaning mechanism. The testers repeated the mud trials multiple times to confirm the results. Every time, the Owen gun outperformed its competitors by dramatic margins. They added sand tests, water immersion tests, and tests where the weapons were deliberately damaged and then fired. The Owen gun consistently proved more reliable than weapons from factories that had been building military firearms for decades. Vincent watched these trials with quiet satisfaction. He had seen what the other officers had missed, and now the results were undeniable. But he also knew that numbers and test results could be buried if they contradicted what senior officers wanted to believe. There would be pressure to dismiss these findings, to argue that the tests were somehow flawed, or that mud resistance didn't matter compared to other factors. That pressure materialized immediately. Officers who had invested their credibility in Thompson or Sten procurement began questioning the trial methodology. Were the mud conditions realistic? Would Australian soldiers really be fighting in such extreme environments? Wasn't the Thompson's proven combat record worth more than laboratory tests? These were face-saving questions from men who realized they had been wrong, but weren't ready to admit it publicly. The decision came down to practicality and timing. It was now early 1942. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. Southeast Asia was falling to Japanese forces. Australian soldiers would be fighting in the jungles of New Guinea within months. There was no time for pride or politics. The Owen gun went into immediate production. Manufacturing began at the Lysacht Works in Port Kembla, with other factories joining production as demand increased. The weapon's simple design, which officers had mocked as crude, now became an advantage. It could be produced quickly using basic machine tools, with tolerances loose enough that parts from different factories were often interchangeable. While the Thompson required precision manufacturing and the Sten required careful assembly despite its simplicity, the Owen gun could be built fast and built in quantity. Evelyn Owen himself enlisted in the Army, serving in the engineering corps. His weapon would go to war, but Owen wouldn't be the one carrying it into combat. That task would fall to Australian infantry soldiers being rushed to New Guinea to face the Japanese advance south toward Australia. These soldiers would provide the ultimate test, not in controlled conditions at a testing range, but in actual combat in some of the worst terrain on Earth. New Guinea in 1942 was hell. The island featured some of the most hostile jungle environment in the world. Dense rainforest where visibility extended only a few feet, mountainous terrain with slopes so steep that soldiers had to haul themselves up by gripping vines, and humidity so intense that nothing ever dried. Rain fell constantly during the monsoon season, turning the ground into bottomless mud. Rivers had to be crossed daily, foxholes filled with water, every metal surface rusted within days. Mold grew on clothing, equipment, and skin. This was also where soldiers would encounter the Japanese infantry, regarded as among the toughest and most determined fighters in the world. Combat in New Guinea wasn't the warfare of grand maneuvers and artillery barrages. It was small unit actions where soldiers often couldn't see the enemy until they were within 10 feet. Ambushes happened at point-blank range. A weapon malfunction meant death. Australian soldiers arriving in New Guinea carried a mix of weapons. Some units still had Thompson submachine guns. Others had Sten guns. The Owen gun was issued to new units and as replacement weapons for existing ones. Within weeks of combat operations, patterns emerged that matched exactly what the mud trials had predicted. Thompson and Sten guns jammed constantly. Soldiers spent as much time clearing malfunctions as they did actually firing at the enemy. The standard procedure became Fire a few rounds, clear the inevitable jam, fire again, clear again. In combat, this was frequently fatal. The Owen gun had problems too. No weapon is perfect, but the difference was dramatic. Where the Thompson might jam after every magazine in jungle conditions, the Owen gun could fire through dozens of magazines with only occasional malfunctions. More importantly, when the Owen gun did jam, it was usually a simple failure that could be cleared quickly by smacking the bolt handle. The Thompson and Sten often required partial disassembly to clear jams, something that was impossible to do while under fire. Word spread fast among the soldiers. Units with Owen guns had higher survival rates. They could maintain suppressive fire while Thompson units were struggling with malfunctions. They won firefights that would have been losses with less reliable weapons. Soldiers began requesting Owen guns specifically, and officers who had access to supply depots made sure their men got them. The weapon earned nicknames. The digger's darling became common, digger being Australian slang for soldier. Some soldiers called it Old Faithful because it kept working when everything else failed. The crude appearance that had been such a source of mockery in headquarters became a point of pride. This wasn't some fancy weapon built in a prestigious factory. This was an Australian gun, built in Australian factories, designed by an Australian civilian, and it worked better than anything the great powers could produce. Statistics from after-action reports confirmed what soldiers knew from experience. Units equipped with Owen guns had significantly lower casualty rates compared to units with Thompson or Sten guns. The difference wasn't marginal. It was often measured in multiples. A unit with Owen guns might have 1/3 the casualties of a comparable unit with Thompsons in the same operations. Some of this was due to weapon reliability allowing better fire discipline and suppression, but much was simply that Owen gun-equipped soldiers could actually fire their weapons when it mattered most. The ultimate validation came from an unexpected source. American soldiers. U.S. forces fighting in the Pacific faced the same jungle conditions as Australians, and they encountered the same reliability problems with their weapons. American infantrymen carried M1 Garand rifles and M1 carbines, both excellent weapons in normal conditions, but prone to jamming in heavy mud and humidity. American soldiers with Thompson submachine guns faced identical reliability problems as their Australian counterparts. When American and Australian units operated together, American soldiers noticed that the Australians had submachine guns that actually worked. The Owen gun's reputation spread through the American ranks. Soldiers started asking Australian troops about the weapon, and some enterprising Americans began offering trades. The black market economy of the Pacific Theater had its own exchange rates. American cigarettes, chocolate, watches, and other luxury items that Australians wanted, traded for Owen guns that Americans desperately needed. Australian soldiers were often willing to trade because they knew that more Owen guns were being produced and issued. If they traded their current weapon for a case of American cigarettes and a Zippo lighter, they could request a replacement Owen gun from their armorer. American soldiers who obtained Owen guns through these trades rarely reported them through official channels because they knew their officers would confiscate them. Instead, they carried the ugly Australian gun into combat and found that it kept them alive. The phenomenon became widespread enough that American officers noticed. Some tried to stop the unauthorized weapon trades. Others quietly looked the other way because they recognized that their soldiers with Owen guns were more effective in combat. A few enterprising American officers actually filed official requests to have Owen guns issued to their units. These requests were denied. Australian production was barely sufficient for Australian forces, and there was no surplus for export. This created absurd situations where American soldiers carrying sophisticated weapons designed by American engineers were desperately trying to obtain Australian weapons that American officers had previously dismissed as crude and inferior. The irony was not lost on anyone. The weapon they had mocked was now the most desired submachine gun in the Pacific Theater. By 1944, the Owen gun had proven itself so thoroughly that it had become standard issue for all Australian infantry in the Pacific. Production had reached its peak, with multiple factories producing the weapon. In total, Australia manufactured approximately 45,000 Owen guns during the war, not an enormous number by the standards of major powers, but sufficient to equip Australian forces throughout the Pacific campaigns. The weapon's performance in New Guinea set patterns that would continue through the rest of the war. As Australian forces moved north through the island campaigns, Bougainville, Borneo, the final Philippines operations, the Owen gun remained the reliable standard. Japanese soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Owen gun's firing, and they knew that Australian troops with that weapon were particularly dangerous, because their weapons wouldn't fail them at critical moments. The end of World War II in 1945 saw most nations quickly phasing out their wartime small arms. The Thompson submachine gun, despite its legendary status, was immediately retired from U.S. service. Too heavy, too complex, too expensive, the Sten gun was kept in British service but only as a cheap reserve weapon, with newer designs prioritized. Most of the specialized weapons developed during the war were obsolete the moment peace came. Not the Owen gun. Australian military planners looked at the weapon's service record and decided it was worth keeping. The gun had proven reliable not just in testing, but in sustained combat across multiple years and multiple environments. It required minimal maintenance. It was cheap to produce. Parts were interchangeable and readily available. There was no compelling reason to replace it with something else. So the Owen gun remained in Australian service. When the Korean War began in 1950, Australian soldiers carried Owen guns into combat again. The weapon performed as reliably in Korea's cold, muddy conditions as it had in New Guinea's tropical jungle. Other nations were fielding newer submachine gun designs, but none proved significantly more reliable than Australia's 15-year-old weapon. The Owen gun continued in service through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Australian forces in the Malayan Emergency carried Owen guns. When Australia deployed forces to Vietnam in the 1960s, many soldiers still carried the same weapon design that had been mocked back in 1939. By this point, the gun was over 20 years old as a design, but it still worked. Eventually, it was replaced by more modern weapons, but its service life exceeded that of virtually every other World War II submachine gun. The statistics tell the story. Most W-20-era weapons were retired within 5 years of the war's end. The Owen gun served for more than 20 years in frontline combat units. Most W-2 submachine guns are remembered as adequate weapons that served their purpose. The Owen gun is remembered as legendary for reliability. Most W-2 weapons are collected by museums and historians. The Owen gun is still valued by collectors, specifically because soldiers loved it. But beyond the statistics and service records, the Owen gun story raises questions that extend far beyond one weapon. How many other innovations have been rejected because they didn't match what experts expected? How many lives were lost because institutions valued conformity over effectiveness? How many good ideas died in committee rooms because they came from the wrong person or looked too different from conventional solutions? The military officers who tried to ban the Owen gun weren't stupid or malicious. They were following established patterns of thought that made sense within their worldview. British and American weapons came from nations with long histories of weapons manufacturing and military success. Aesthetic polish and conventional design suggested professional engineering. Established relationships with foreign suppliers made procurement smoother. All of these seemed like reasonable considerations when evaluating a new weapon, but these reasonable considerations nearly cost Australian soldiers a weapon that would save thousands of lives. The 2 years between Owen's initial design and the comparative trials represent time when the weapon could have been refined, production capacity built up, and soldiers trained. If Gerard Vincent had not pushed for proper testing, the Owen gun might never have been produced at all. Australian soldiers would have gone to New Guinea with Thompson and Sten guns, faced reliability problems that killed soldiers, and never known there had been a better option. This pattern repeats throughout history. During World War I, British generals dismissed the tank because it didn't fit conventional concepts of how warfare should work. In World War II, German generals initially rejected the MP-40 submachine gun because automatic weapons seemed wasteful of ammunition compared to disciplined rifle fire. The U.S. military resisted the M16 rifle in Vietnam, despite test results showing it was superior to existing weapons. Each case followed the same pattern: institutional bias against unconventional solutions, especially when they came from unexpected sources. The bias is often aesthetic as much as functional. The Owen gun looked crude, so it was assumed to be inferior. The M16 rifle looked like a toy made of plastic and aluminum, so career officers who grew up with wooden-stocked rifles didn't trust it. The tank looked absurd compared to cavalry horses. Human beings make judgments based on appearance, and institutions amplify these individual biases into systemic resistance to innovation. There's also the problem of credentials. Evelyn Owen was a civilian with no formal engineering training. In a military culture that valued professional credentials and institutional authority, this immediately made his design suspect. If the same weapon had been presented by an engineer from an established armaments company, it would likely have received serious consideration immediately. The idea mattered less than who was presenting it. Colonial attitudes made the problem worse. Australia in 1939 still largely saw itself as a subordinate nation within the British Commonwealth. The assumption that important innovations came from Britain or America wasn't just military doctrine, it was cultural conditioning. Australians themselves had internalized the idea that they were followers rather than leaders in military technology. When someone like Owen challenged this assumption, he faced resistance not just from British-oriented officers, but from Australians who couldn't imagine their country producing something superior to what the great powers made. All of these biases nearly killed a weapon that would become legendary. They almost certainly did kill other innovations that never got past the initial rejection. For every Owen gun that eventually received proper testing and validation, how many other good ideas died in obscurity because their inventors didn't have a Gerard Vincent to champion them? How many soldiers died using inferior equipment because better options were dismissed without testing? The cost of these institutional biases isn't just measured in lost efficiency or missed opportunities. In military context, the cost is measured in lives. Every Australian soldier who died in New Guinea with a jammed Thompson in his hands represents a failure of the system that rejected the Owen gun. Every American soldier who wanted an Owen gun but couldn't get one because production was limited represents the cost of not recognizing innovation earlier. These aren't abstract policy failures. They're young men dead because institutions couldn't see past their own assumptions. The Owen gun worked because its design prioritized function over form. The top-mounted magazine looked strange, but it solved a real problem. The crude steel construction looked unprofessional, but it allowed rapid production and easy repair. Every design choice that made the weapon ugly by conventional standards also made it more reliable in actual combat conditions. Function over form wasn't just a design philosophy, it was a principle that saved lives. This principle extends beyond weapons design. In any field, there's a temptation to value things that look right over things that work right. Businesses make decisions based on how proposals are presented, rather than their actual merit. Governments implement policies that sound good in speeches but fail in practice. Individuals choose options that seem prestigious over options that would actually serve their needs better. The Owen gun is a reminder that what works matters more than what looks good. There's also a lesson about listening to people outside the establishment. Evelyn Owen had no credentials that should have mattered to military procurement officers. He wasn't a professional engineer. He didn't work for an armaments company. He had no military experience. By every conventional measure, he was exactly the wrong person to design a military weapon. And yet he designed one of the most reliable submachine guns of World War II because he approached the problem without the preconceptions that limited professional designers. This pattern appears in innovation across fields. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not aeronautical engineers. Steve Jobs wasn't a computer scientist. Many breakthrough innovations come from outsiders who don't know what's supposed to be impossible. Institutional expertise is valuable, but it can also become institutional blindness. The experts know what has worked before, what the best practices are, what the standards require. Sometimes those experts are exactly right, and sometimes they're exactly wrong. The challenge is distinguishing between cranks with worthless ideas and innovators with breakthrough concepts. Not every unconventional design is secretly brilliant. Most are actually bad. The military officers who rejected the Owen gun had probably seen dozens of civilian designs that were genuinely terrible. Their skepticism wasn't unreasonable. It just happened to be wrong in this case. The solution isn't to accept every unconventional idea uncritically. The solution is to test rigorously and follow the results even when they contradict expectations. That's what the comparative trials in 1941 represented, a commitment to testing rather than assumptions. Once the Owen gun was actually tested against its competitors in realistic conditions, the results were undeniable, but it took 2 years and a desperate military situation to force those tests to happen. A better system would have tested the weapon immediately when Owen first proposed it in 1939. Even if initial tests had revealed flaws, they would have provided concrete data rather than aesthetic judgments. The Owen gun's legacy lives on in Australian military culture. The weapon itself is retired, but it represents something larger, a moment when Australia produced something genuinely world-class in military technology, when an underdog civilian inventor beat the military-industrial complex of major powers, when the ugly option proved superior to the beautiful one. It's a story Australians tell with pride, and it's a story that contains lessons for anyone facing institutional resistance to innovation. For Australian soldiers, the legacy is simpler and more direct. The Owen gun was the weapon that kept working when everything else failed. In the jungles of New Guinea, in the mud of Korea, in operations across the Pacific, it was the gun that fired when soldiers needed it most. Thousands of Australian soldiers came home from war because their weapons didn't jam at the critical moment. That's Evelyn Owen's legacy, not in design patents or manufacturing records, but in lives saved by a weapon that almost never existed because it was too ugly for the military establishment to take seriously. The weapon they tried to ban became the weapon that saved an army. The design they mocked became the standard against which reliability was measured. The civilian they dismissed changed military history. And all of it happened because one officer, Gerard Vincent, had the judgment to look past appearances and insist on proper testing. That might be the most important lesson of all. Institutions need people willing to question assumptions, demand evidence, and follow results regardless of what conventional wisdom suggests. The Owen gun is gathering dust in museums now, a relic of a war fought 80 years ago, but the principles it represents remain current: function over form, testing over assumption, results over credentials, innovation from unexpected sources, and the courage to recognize when conventional wisdom is wrong. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in 1939, when a 24-year-old civilian walked into military headquarters with a design that looked like plumbing, but worked like a miracle. If you enjoyed this story of how an ugly weapon proved everyone wrong, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Drop a comment below. What other rejected innovations do you think deserve their own story? Your support keeps these forgotten tales alive.